invite the pastor of this great church up to welcome you guys and to open us up in a time of prayer. Amen.
Well, welcome to again First Chinese Baptist Church, and I'm a little disturbed though. You're starting to look a lot like Baptists. All of you sitting in the back row. I want to spread out a little bit. Well, it's really good to have you here, and you may not know, but First Chinese Baptist Church this year will be celebrating 130 years. It's a great church. It's a diverse congregation, and we're just excited to have you here. And so let's get started with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we just want to pause and say thank you for this opportunity to gather as faith and community and the No Name Fellowship, and just take an opportunity to fellowship and to gather. But most of all, Lord, we want to ask for your wisdom, that we'll have the opportunity and the wisdom to ask the right questions and have the wisdom to listen to the answers. And so, Lord, just guide us tonight. Allow us to enjoy this time of fellowship, learning, growth, and worship. And we ask it all, Lord, of course, in your name, in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
So welcome to part 2 of the Race in Fresno panel series. This was brought to you by Faith and Community and the No Name Fellowship. Faith and Community is a part of the PICO National Network. PICO stands for People Improving Communities Through Organizing. We're in 32 states and 150 cities across America, and we work with congregations, multi-faith religious institutions to connect clergy and lay leaders to issues of justice in our city. Locally, Faith and Community works with 20 congregations and 2 institutions. The No Name Fellowship is a local board of faith leaders in our community that arose in Fresno after the LA riots of 1992. What they discovered was, after the riots of 1992, they discovered that Fresno pastors and the city of Fresno as a whole was divided along the lines of race. And so what they want to do is, what their mission is for the No Name Fellowship, is to release God's resources for rebuilding of our city through reconciled relationships. So that's why the No Name Fellowship exists. And this is brought to you by the No Name Fellowship and Faith and Community. A little bit of context to why we are here this evening to discuss this critical issue of race. And I realized I did not even introduce my own self. My name is Bryson White, and I'm a minister at St. Rose Baptist Church and a community organizer with Faith and Community. A little context to why we're here. 2 major events in the past few years have brought the issue of race back into national dialogue in a powerful way. Those events are the election of Barack Obama as the first African-American president of the United States. The second event, unfortunately, is much tragic, that being the death of Trayvon Martin in Florida. Both events have sparked massive dialogue around the way race and racism do or do not manifest themselves within our country. There were many responses to the latter event, the death of Trayvon Martin. People protested, people marched, and they expressed a variety of opinions in response to this critical issue. Here in Fresno, as a response to the tragic death of Trayvon Martin and the issue of race that is brought to the fore in our country, a group of leaders from Faith and Community and the No Name Fellowship decided that we should have a series of dialogues about race and how it manifests itself in the city of Fresno. With the blessing and participation of local pastors, we held our first panel discussion on September 26, 2013 at the Westside Church of God, pastored by Paul Benjamin. The participants in the first panel that we had were Pastor B.T. Lewis, who's with us this evening, Pastor Natalie Chamberlain, who's also with us this evening, Pastor Jim Franklin, Pastor Brad Bell, Pastor D.J. Kreiner, Pastor Eli Lorea, and Father Gabriel Ruiz. Our time together showed us that even though the topic yields different responses, we can still have an honest dialogue around the issue of race. We are hopeful that tonight will continue in this vein. Tonight we'll be focusing on how racism manifests itself in interpersonal relationships. In what ways do we personally contribute to racism in our society? In what ways do we personally contribute how racial chasms can be bridged in our society? And what ways do interpersonal issues of race manifest themselves into our society structurally? Our moderator will guide you all in this journey in a few minutes. Keep in mind that this is the second part in the Race in Fresno series, and the third installment will take place on Thursday, May 22nd at 6 p.m. at a location that is to be determined. But this third installment will focus solely on the intersection of race and mass incarceration in the United States. What we ask of you all tonight is to be open, to be able to hear differing opinions, to be open to different experiences being told. We ask that you wrestle, each one of us wrestle with the words that are said this evening. We also ask that you believe that each person on the panel has the best intentions at heart, even if things are spoken in a way that you do not agree with. Let's believe and hope that we are here to wrestle with the hard things in life, but we do so with respect for one another. Amen? Does the congregation consent to that? All right. Up next, I would like to invite Pastor Booker Lewis of the Rising Star Missionary Baptist Church up, and Pastor Natalie Chamberlain of the United Church of Christ. Could you give them a hand clap? So Pastors Lewis and Chamberlain were two of the 8 original panelists that we had in our first panel on September 26th, and they agreed to just answer a few questions about their experience on September 26th, and also what subsequently followed from that panel discussion. Yeah, I guess I should have passed them a microphone as well. The first question that I have for both of you, all these questions are for both of you guys, is what impact, if any, did the first panel discussion have in creating or deepening your relationship with pastors who are of a different ethnicity than you are?
Well, I already had a relationship, at least functioning relationship with both Pastor Lewis and Pastor Kreiner, and I think that it has made it easier to have some discussions, and it certainly has, it's kept us smiling and laughing at one another over some things that we share. So I think it was a really enriching experience.
Okay, so I think that I like Natalie. I think that it wasn't the beginning of building relationships across racial lines, but it certainly opened up my awareness, and it helped me to see things a little bit differently. Like Bryson was saying, what you hear tonight, you want to try it on, you want to listen, and you want to process what you hear. Perhaps it will open up a new avenue of understanding that you didn't have before. I know it did that for me. I don't know how much I'm supposed to talk about that question. In the last panel, we talked my colleagues talked a lot about context and not understanding the context from which I was coming from, maybe others were coming from, and that was a relevant point. And so after the time between now and the panel discussion before, we have spent some time on understanding one another's place in the community and context, the context of that place, and trying to understand where we're coming from. I don't want to answer all your questions at once.
Thank you, Pastor Lewis and Chamberlain. The second question is, what value is there in pastors and leaders of our city coming together to discuss racial issues? What value is there?
For me, I think the real value comes in being, if we are going to be leaders, then we need to set an example. And if we can honestly discuss issues that are difficult and do it in a way that is not necessarily putting aside differences, but in a way that honors one another and the places we come from, and even when we can't agree, to still find value in the people with whom we have our conversation. That's something that doesn't get modeled in our society very often. And if the clergy and faith leaders in this community can't model that, then there's nobody else that's going to step up and do it for us. So we need to be doing that, and I think this is a good start.
Okay, so on every level of leadership, we have to take the elephant out of the room. We can work together on surface issues, but many times, even when we work together on surface issues, the elephant of racism remains in the room. I had to leave Fresno in order to rise above a level of management, because at the company where I was in 1989, I started in 2000, they said I could go no higher in this city. And so I had to go to the Bay Area in order to be considered. And that was a straight out, that was advice given very bluntly by one of the vice presidents in the company that I was working for. You can't stay here and go higher. There's a ceiling on you. And it was because I was African American. And so the skills you have to take those to another place. So I think that we have to stop ignoring the elephant in the room and stop pretending that it doesn't exist. And we have a natural tendency that when we see people, we begin to size them up. We begin to think about who they are and who they might be based on color of skin, based on how they dress, based on who they're with. We begin to size them up. And so we have to begin to change our consciousness about how we interact with one another, so that we get to know one another well enough to work with one another without having all of these isms in the room with us.
You're doing good, Pastor. What advice do you guys have this evening for today's panelists, if any? What advice do you have in terms of how to operate on the panel?
Enjoy the folks you're with. I mean, I look around the room and I know an awful lot of you, and I know the panelists that I didn't know all the folks I was on the panel with, but I had the place of honor. I got to be between DJ and Booker, but enjoy it because we don't often get the privilege of being in this place. And it is a privilege to be in this place. And you do get to learn things about folks you wouldn't learn otherwise. So I do just enjoy it.
Okay, so I learned last time that we can't solve all the problems in one night. We can't hit all the issues in one night. Some people left the panel, why don't we talk about this? Why don't we talk about that? We can't do everything in one night. And so we have to be faithful to the idea of working together to try to work through all of the issues that we face together as humanity. I would say to the panel, be honest, be respectful, but don't let your courtesy hinder your honesty. We have to be able to have thick enough skin to have real conversations about real issues that we face and that our families face every day. And so even though a preacher told me one time, he said, let Lewis tell it because he can tell bad news and people smile. And so you have to be able to, like Norman, me and Norman have a really good relationship, and I can tell Norman, I love you, but we're going to have to do this differently. And so be willing to allow somebody to challenge your view and to maybe offer you a different view and consider that view. Was that the last question? Yes. Okay, so let me share this. Let me share this really quickly. So one of the things that really impressed me after the panel is that, I was kind of dumbfounded, right? And I'm like, man, what was that? And what do we do next? And so I got invited to Sunnyside to Susan? Amanda, sorry. Amanda's class to talk about some of my history and some of my context. And so that was really exciting for me. Amanda Peterson, yeah. And so that was really exciting for me to kind of just share that and allow some students to ask questions of some of the things that I experienced. Brad Bell, let me put something out here for Brad Bell. He's not here, and he wouldn't tell you if he was. But Brad Bell made a very, he just made a very strong effort to reach out to some of us. And we had private meetings with him. In preacher world, we talk about private meetings where we can cuss real good. That don't mean we really cussing, it just means we talk straight. Talk straight, we ask some straight questions and give some very poignant answers. And so we did that. Also another thing that happened is that we've also engaged in some other activities together that are not related to the race, just related to faith issues. We worked together on a workshop one Saturday and had a long conversation after that. I taught a couple of classes and he closed it with a presentation at the end. So there has been some interaction that probably would not have happened if it were not for the panel discussion. And I think that as we have those kind of follow-ups, we build relationships with one another. And that helps us going forward to have the tough conversations about race.
I've got one thing I'd like to share. Something about personal learning for me. Like I said, I was sitting between DJ and Booker, and one of the questions I answered, part of my answer was when we get it through our fat heads. And Booker looked at me and said, "You can't say that." I said, "I just did say it." And it just reminded me that even in that place, I was speaking from a position of power, privilege. I could say something that Booker couldn't have said without having, no one commented about it except me. And, and you know, God bless my friend Booker for pointing out in that place and at that time that whether we think about it or not, we function in places that our society has placed us. And whether it's fair or unfair, whether it's right or wrong, whether it's just or unjust, it happens. And in learning well enough in my place, what it is to be privileged means that I have a responsibility to make sure that I don't abuse that place. And I thank you, my friend, for that.
I would be remiss if I did not mention that Brad Bell would have liked to be here, Pastor Bell, but he's out of the country, as well as Pastor DJ Kreiner, who's actually in Sacramento for a revival. And if you can bear with me for one moment, Pastor Kreiner wrote some remarks that he wanted me to share to you all today. His remarks go as such. Good day. I wish that I were here that I was there with you all to share in this discussion. However, I'm under obligations to stand here in Sacramento and preach. I did want to make a few remarks in regards to our experience that we shared in the race panel in September and the personal experiences since then. The panel itself shed light on an ongoing issue that has divided our city and nation as a whole. The discussion on race is a taboo subject matter, and to have leaders of the faith-based community discuss it openly was an awesome experience. I wish we had more time to allow the personal issues that have affected us individually to have been expressed, but I'm grateful to have shared in this experience. I have formed relationships with individuals such as Pastor Brad Bell and Pastor Eli that I would not have had if it would not have been for this panel. Since then, it has been a test and a will of faith, of will and faith. I have witnessed and been the victim of race relations or the lack thereof on several occasions. In October, I was in the habit in Figard Village, and a Caucasian lady and man refused to be in the same restaurant with me. As I walked in, she grabbed her purse, and after I ordered, I sat by her on the bench to wait for my food, and she immediately got up and left the restaurant without picking up the food she had just paid for. I guess she was in a hurry. This incident is just an example of many of the encounters of racism I have witnessed recently. Television has helped perpetuate the discussion on race, when a black man such as Richard Sherman can be called a thug for expressing himself vocally after a game, but 8 hockey players are called men who have passion for the game when they drop their gloves and fight 2 seconds into the face-off? How is it possible that a high school graduate who finished Dominguez High in Compton with a 4.1 GPA, accept a full-ride scholarship to Stanford, maintain a 3.8 GPA at Stanford for 3 years, have an exceptional track record in the NFL with no history of drug abuse, alcohol abuse, battery charges, but instead goes back to Compton 4 times a year to educate kids on how to finish high school and college, be labeled a thug, be labeled a criminal and gangster because of what he says about football, but 8 hockey players are labeled men of passion. For those, 4 of those men have a history in the NHL of being the enforcers on their teams. 2 have been suspended more than once, and 1 said it was his first time ever on the ice in the NHL, and he was put in just to fight. I know how it's possible, because 1 is black and 8 are white. I understand now. 1 looks like a thug because he has dreadlocks, and 8 look clean cut, like they were on the Pleasantville movie. My post-panel experiences have allowed me to see more than I saw prior to it, but it's because of that I believe I can become a voice for those who have none. Each of us as clergy have to stop thinking in a closed box. Racism is alive, Pastor Kleiner says. Discrimination does exist. Trayvon Martin was not the first, it will not be the last. But when we as clergy wake up and see that as long as we have our eyes closed to the issue will never get solved. Sorry for the longevity of this message. I'm like a Pringles can, when my mouth pops open to talk. Once I pop, it's hard to stop. Pastor DJ is also an MC on his downtime as a rapper. So those are Pastor Kreiner's comments. Before I pass the microphone to our moderator for the evening, Pastor Phil Scott, just a couple of housekeeping notes. If you are a tweeter and you would like to tweet for the evening, the hashtag for the night is Race in Fresno. Hashtag Race in Fresno. Also, if you have questions that you would like to be asked during our Q&A time, you can go to Andrew Fire. Raise your hand, Andrew. He's going to be in the back along with myself, and we'll be taking questions and screening them. And that's how your question will be asked during the Q&A time. If I could invite Pastor Phil Sky onto the stage, and then if you guys can give a round of applause to
Good evening. How are we doing tonight? Are we doing well? Yeah. It is incredible to be in this beautiful building. This is an incredible church, isn't it? Yeah. Pastor Danny, I don't know where he is, but Pastor Danny Jack, thank you for so graciously hosting us here tonight. It was my joy to come and sit with him, I don't know, a few weeks ago, and we walked through this wonderful place that, as he shared, this church has a 130-year history. And so he mentioned to me a couple of things that I found fascinating. We talked, there he is. Pastor Danny, I was just thanking you for hosting us. Yeah. And you know, one of the things that he shares is that these beautiful panes of stained glass were all originally designed by people here in this church. And so this is an incredible place. And so I want to extend an invitation on behalf of Pastor Danny. I hope that some of you would consider at some point in the future coming and visiting, just being with this wonderful faith community at some point in the future. Wow, so much has already been said. This is great. I want to, it's my role tonight to moderate a conversation, and so having that be my task, I want to invite our panelists up at this point. So why don't you all come up and grab a chair, and we're going to want to spread those microphones out a little bit. And as they come, you know, I want to just echo a couple of things that have been stated already. I really appreciated Pastor Natalie and Pastor Lewis, their reflections since the prior panel. Pastor Lewis, thank you for, you said it so eloquently, in terms of what we hope tonight's conversation ought to be about. And so that really is our goal, is that our courtesy, I think you said, our courtesy would not impede or hinder our honesty. Oftentimes in the workplace, at the bus stop, at schools, wherever you might find yourself, the conversation about race, while it is interwoven throughout every experience of every day of all of our lives, whether we are keenly aware of it or completely blind to it, it is true that when we do begin to have this conversation, either the conversation is so safe that it's not honest any longer, or it is so direct and blunt and honest that it doesn't feel safe anymore. And so people disengage. And what we're trying to do tonight is a very difficult task as a panel, and that is that we would strike that middle ground. I don't know how to do that. That's just something that we're going to ask the Lord to help us with. But that's our task tonight. In the spirit of this conversation, as a conversation about race, we stand sort of understanding that the first conversation laid a foundation. And tonight we just hope to further the conversation. So I, again, appreciate the comments that were just made in that we couldn't talk about this in its entirety or completely thoroughly in one evening. And so we are here tonight and we will gather again. And even at the end of that third conversation, we will still just scratch the surface. But I hope that this is a space where you can engage your own sense of ethnic identity. You'll begin to understand the journey of others in the room and others in our city, and that this conversation will lead us into places in our city where we have not yet gone, into healthier places as a community of people living in the same geography. Amen? In the spirit of this conversation, I need to just acknowledge my wife is here, Reese, in the back. Yeah. Reese should really be doing what I'm doing, but she's in back because she's awesome. And she is caring for our two children. Reese, I mentioned Reese, one, because I love her, she's my best friend. But also because she has been my teacher and mentor concerning all things racial reconciliation since she was 14 years old. She's been teaching me. And so I am, the only reason I feel like I can even be here and ask questions tonight is because she's been teaching me for the last 22 years. And now we have the joy of seeing how another generation understands race in our world as we are raising two biracial children. And so we get to understand race through their eyes every day of the week. And it is a joy, and yet it's still very challenging. I can introduce this distinguished panel, but we've asked tonight that they would introduce themselves by sharing a little bit. We gave them some thoughts and said, would you share a little bit of your cultural autobiography? And so I want to create space for that. And again, I'm going to let them introduce themselves, starting with Reverend Nesson. Your family, that Bakersfield weather is good for the health. You're correct, was not telling the truth. You know that. Because Fresno weather is good for your health. Bakersfield is terrible. Fresno is outstanding, especially when it rains. Well, thank you. You know, I wanted to say, you know, we decided in putting this evening together that really is best for our panelists to introduce themselves to you, because as they begin to share their perspectives on race, that it would be helpful to you all to hear a little bit of their background and upbringing and history, and how they sort of how they identify themselves in some basic way. But beyond that, I hope it extends far beyond that you received it as I did yesterday, and as the panelists did, as we sat around a table and did much of what we just did now. I hope that you received it as a gift to hear just a slice of the stories of the people who are sitting on this panel tonight. Let's get to it. I want to ask a question, if I can. I think it would be good, maybe, Dr. Apu, why don't you start us, and then, because I want everyone to respond to this. The question is this. Panel, what ways have you experienced racism in Fresno? And I just want to say as a disclaimer that you know, if you're not paying attention to our city very much, then I don't know, it depends on how you experience our city. But I will say that there are plenty of stories to go around that just simply state, and we should not ignore the fact that there is racism in our city. Pastor Norman and Reverend Sophia, just want to acknowledge, in case the audience didn't quite catch it, you all are newer to our city, so you respond however you feel appropriate. Okay, Dr. Blue.
Thank you. We've been in Fresno for 34 years. 34 years. And when I think of racism, I have to provide a little context that for me, racism is sort of on a continuum. All the way from microaggressions, those little things that maybe other folks wouldn't even notice, and I'll describe some of those, all the way to those specific and intentional acts of racism, kind of in the middle. Sometimes unintentional, specific, but maybe unintentional, specific and maybe intentional, all the way to structural racism or institutional racism. So it's a continuum. So microaggressions, what are those? Something I've experienced recently, microaggressions of racism. Being the first at a restaurant, right? And the hostess isn't there. My family is standing there. Before the hostess comes back, a white family comes in, right? And when the hostess comes up, what does she do? She automatically goes to the white family and say, "Can I help you?" Microaggression. So do I get a double microaggression? Does a white family say, "Oh, they were here first"? Or do they say, "Yes, we'd like a table for 3"? You understand what I'm saying? So that's a microaggression. A microaggression being a 60-year-old woman at Target and a 20-something-year-old woman, when I walk up, says, "What's up?" Excuse me? And I said, "What did you say?" And she said, oh, can I help you?" I said, "But that's not what you said. What did you say?" I can talk about what happened after that, but I won't. Yes, I did talk to the manager because she needed to learn that that was inappropriate. I don't think she would have done that to someone else. To say to someone with gray hair, "What's up?" But to me, that was a microaggression. Okay. The person who says to her friend in the store when she sees me, "Watch your purse." Okay? A microaggression. Or the store clerk when I walk in that goes, "Do you want something?" "I'm in your store." That's very different from, "Hi, can I help you?" Microaggressions. They happen daily, daily. And in and of themselves, by themselves, but they build. They build. All the way to specific incidents of intentional racism. Being in a 7-Eleven and holding my hand out for the change and it gets thrown on the counter. I was in my 20s then, so I really won't tell you what I did there. Being disrespected as a faculty member in my classes when I teach, in ways that other faculty are not disrespected. The school experiences of my children, my daughter being the only African American in the class and being a very dark child. And whenever someone was talking, the teacher automatically kept calling her name and telling her to be quiet. And her saying to me, "But Mommy, I wasn't even talking." Okay, specific acts, unintentional maybe, but specific. Or my second born writing a wonderful paper when she was 8 years old, and the teacher writing a note and putting the paper on the wall that parents shouldn't write their children's papers for them. This is my daughter who is now at Indiana University with a full-ride fellowship as a poet. She was a writer even then. But the assumption that she could not have written a paper that good. Are you following me tonight? Yeah. Okay. And lastly, again with one of my daughters, a little boy when they were listening to a tape of Martin Luther King, looking at my daughter and going, "Wachuku's black, pow, pow, pow." And the teacher saying, "Oh, he didn't mean anything by it." Where she had a wonderful opportunity to have a teachable moment for the children. We talked about that, don't you think I did? Or her being chosen to play Mary along with Joseph in the school play. And a little girl crying, because, not because she didn't get the part, but she said she was crying because my daughter got the part and Mary wasn't black. That teacher handled it beautifully. She handled it beautifully. all the way to structural racism. How far do I have to go? I live downtown. How far do I have to go in my neighborhood to a drugstore, to a movie theater, to a grocery store? I could go on and on. So have I experienced racism in Fresno? In many, many different ways.
Thank you. Thank you. I would like to hear from all.
Perfect. So, according to the Myers-Briggs MJ, so I love schedule and I love being on time. So, for that disclaimer, I'm just going to share one story with you guys of how I've experienced racism. And so, I failed to mention earlier that I grew up in an apartment complex on the west side called Kings Estate, or formerly known as, or sometimes known as the Dog Pound. So, my family and I have lived there for a few years already, and our family's just growing, and we're just getting really big. The apartment complex where we live just no longer can. It was harder for us to live there because it was just we were grown up, and the space wasn't enough for us to operate as a family. So my sisters, I've got 5 older sisters and 2 brothers, and so 2 of my sisters started the process of looking into a house to rent, and like any responsible young adult, they researched it, they found a house that was put up for rent, and they put in an application. So they decided to, instead of emailing it, they decided to go to the office to where this company owned this house, and they dropped it off in the office. But when they had gone into the office, they actually were greeted by a lady who happens to be white, and in that moment, the lady takes the application and started just briefly questioning them, and kind of like an interview type, just to get a better understanding of where my family was coming from, why did they want to move, or why were they looking into this house, to their income level. And so within, for some reason, after her brief interaction with my sisters, without running the credit check, without looking into my sister's reference, she thought she had sufficient information to deny my sister's application, and made it clear to my sisters that she wouldn't be showing my sisters the house. So that's how I personally and community-wise I've experienced racism. So yeah.
I guess we're going to go in order down this way here. Okay. In the 6 years that I've been here, the very first awareness that I had given me when I came to Fresno was a description by various interfaith community leaders saying, you know, there is this distinction in Fresno of everything south of Shaw and north of Shaw. And that was my introduction to Fresno. And that was a clear signal that there was something afoot in Fresno that had to deal with issues of ethnicity and race. More specific personal interactions. Some of you may have had the experience that I've had of standing in a line at a grocery store with people ahead of us who are on SNAP and food stamp certificates. People making comments about those who are using those in line. And invariably, the comments have to do more with people of color than not. Other instances in which I've become immersed into the realities of racism in Fresno have come through a series of interactions that I've been invited into and have produced some great learning opportunities. Very soon after I came here, the whole Jeremiah Wright piece resulted in a community conversation that took place. And it was very interesting discovering that among the largely white commentators, how Dr. Wright, who was a member, who at the time was pastor of the largest church in my denomination, was just vilified, and that was taken completely contextually, used to an advantage to diminish and demean him as a black person, and therefore a major candidate for the presidency. I experienced that in numerous settings throughout the city. Another experience that I had that was very illuminating was being invited, my wife, Jan, was here with me also this evening. We were invited to take part in a roundtable conversation at Fresno Pacific University, organized by Dr. Karen Crozier, in which we had a very serious conversation about Michelle Alexander's recently released book, The New Jim Crow. And to just simply absorb the stories that were told around that circle just left us just sort of numb, coming into this community and hearing the reality of other people's experiences. So without going into even greater detail, I had numerous experiences like that, but those, as coming into this community, those were some of the very first impressions with which I was left.
I have only been in Fresno for 6 months, so my experiences in the community are very new. So I'm going to choose to share microaggressions, is actually, believe it or not, what I've experienced so far since I've been here, and then I'm going to share a more pointed experience that's from outside of Fresno. So I actually live in Clovis, not in Fresno. I made a decision to live close to the church. So I'm an 8-minute drive from church, but you might imagine that someone who looks like me is not always expected in some of the places in Clovis where I either shop or do any of the things you do to live day to day. So my most frequent experiences of racism in Fresno are generally being received with surprise. And why would you be present in this place, whether it's a supermarket or a drugstore or whatever it is. And I actually have that experience pretty frequently in the neighborhood in which I live. I'm going to throw a difficult word into the room, so fair warning. One of the things that's interesting about being the age that I am on this panel is that I experience a changing face of racism in the United States. And so sometimes what is considered more blatant becomes more about issues that interact with various identities. I find that I most experience racial or ethnic prejudice, which is different from the kind of institutional systematic racism that Dr. Aputo was talking about, in places where I'm assumed to have authority. And so, you know, we talk about children usually can tell you what age they first experienced racial difference is something they noticed. Another one in this country, unfortunately, I wish this wasn't true, is the first time someone called you nigger in a public space. So my first time was only about 3 or 4 years ago, which is pretty remarkable. And it is when I was wearing a clerical collar, walking back from an Occupy rally in San Francisco. And so I sometimes, and I live that experience because it's kind of so clear-cut about bias, but also because the only visible markers other than my physical appearance was that I was dressed as clergy. And there's something about authority and being unexpected that is a common experience for me with racial and ethnic prejudice, bias, and oppression in the United States.
So what ways have I experienced racism in Fresno? I don't really know where to start instead. Well, I mean, I would love to share a lot. I think about my hard-working community, particularly my Latino family who have had to work hard and live in silence for a very long time because, well, you know, a lot of them migrated into this country and have had to live with fear of not just being caught and deported, which happened to my dad, but also being assaulted by people that prey on the vulnerable. But I think for me specifically, I just want to share particularly about the justice system. And I know that some may say that the system is no longer racist because it's not explicit about that. But I don't think that it has to be explicit in order for it to be racist. I think the ghost of racism continues to live in our structures. And the way I see it is sort of like a person, all right? A person who is racist does not have to be blatant about it. That person does not have to say something, doesn't have to go around and call black people niggers or Hispanic people wetbacks, but you can see it in the way they treat you. So if a person treats me differently and then treats another person in the same skin color in the same way, without even saying nigger or wetback or anything like that, I know that that person is racist because the way he or she has treated me. So I just I'll share this short story. When I first started participating at First Presbyterian Church and I got really embraced, I had a lot of adventure becoming an intern with this summer high school ministry internship called Network Days. And that was an incredible thing. I learned a lot. One of the requirements was I had to live with one of the families in my church. And I took a lot of things that I learned from that family and the congregation. But something that I'll never forget was when we were standing in the front lawn having a small event. I can't remember exactly what the event was, but an officer drove by and he smiled at us all and he waved. And that was so foreign to me. That was so foreign to me. Because in my neighborhood, officers, I live in downtown Fresno, predominantly Hispanic community. In my neighborhood, officers don't drive around and wave and smile at you, throw thumbs up at you. In fact, if you wave, they might actually pull you over and ask you, why are you being a smartass? And it's sad to me that in my neighborhood, I have young boys that I work with who, at a young age, they want to be cops. I don't know why, movies, I have no idea. But at some point, they hit the age where they say, I hate cops. I don't want to be an officer. So I think the spirit of racism is experienced, not just because of words, but behavior.
I can say that I myself have experienced racism here in Fresno, of course, based on my skin color. But there's a history of racism against Armenians in this town. When I moved here first in 1956, there were restrictive covenants, which I'm sure included Asians, blacks, Latinos, and Armenians. There were none of those living on Van Ness Avenue. So there were restrictive covenants and other ways in which we were discriminated against. I was reminiscing with Pastor Norman here about when the Armenians came. They were congregational, many of them, because they'd been helped by the congregational missionaries overseas. And they attended the first congregational church before they had their own church. And there came a time when they were asked to sit on one side of the church and the other people would sit on the other side of the church. Now, that might be an example of what I call olfactory racism, because the Armenians love to excess their garlic. And this created a problem on Sunday mornings. But there was other types of racism, obviously. In fact, many Armenians changed their names to English, type names, no IAN, just so they could get hired, so they could progress in their businesses. And these things were done to a great deal. Among gang members, obviously, you must hate to shoot each other. But what we found was when a Hmong helps a Latino, a black helps an Anglo, or a Latino helps a Laotian to transform their lives, barriers are smashed by the grace of Christ. They realize we are all human beings in the same need, with the same desires, and the same hopes, and the same dreams, and we just need a chance.
Thank you all. Thank you for your responses. Some clergy and community leaders in this city have said to me that when we have a conversation like we're having tonight about race and racism, that really the more we talk about race and racism, the more we are creating a problem that doesn't really exist. It's been said to me many times by clergy and community leaders in Fresno. Now, after hearing your responses as a panel, it seems that you all disagree with those expressions. So really then, our conversation, if you don't believe what I just said, but rather you believe that racism really does exist in this city, then really what we are doing tonight is we're creating an opportunity to begin to engage this conversation and to potentially work toward this idea of racial reconciliation. Maytag, you called yourself a bridge builder in your introduction. Would you talk a little bit about how you have participated in bridging the racial and ethnic divide here in Fresno?
Okay. So the question is, how have I participated in bridging the racial ethnic divide here in Fresno? And when I was thinking about this question, there were three things that really stuck out to me. First thing is intentionality. Second is relationships. Third thing is sharing my experiences, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on each. And so what I mean by intentionality is I seek to be intentional, not just with my friendships, but also in the specific community that I physically live in, right? So I currently live in a predominantly Spanish-speaking Latino community in downtown Fresno. I don't have to, but I choose to be intentional about my geographic location of where I physically am located in Fresno. The second thing, relationship. So I'm intentional about building relationships that are across ethnic lines, and particularly I don't mean just acquaintances, but these are relationships that I work with on a consistent basis, and that I have built rapport with, but also I have trust with them. And so and these particular relationships, I get the opportunity to ask them hard and sometimes naive questions about their specific ethnic groups. So for example, I have a really good friend of mine here today. She's Latina, her name's Ariana Martinez, who we've been friends for about 2 years. We're pretty consistent with each other. We're pretty, really good trust with each other. But she's also someone that I can actually not only share my Hmong experiences and struggles and heartaches and all that stuff about Hmong culture with her, but I also get to ask her questions about her Latino culture. And she gets to help me, in some sense, she acts like a cultural broker for the Latino community and helping educate me on the Latino community. The third thing that I mentioned was sharing my experiences, right? I'm intentional about surrounding myself with folks who are willing and ready to journey with me, not just to listen, but to also to lament and just to hear me share my experiences. And I'm willing, I choose, and I'm willing to share my minority experiences with others. And in sharing my experiences with others, I'm choosing to be a cultural broker and bridge builder. So 3 things: intentionality, relationships, and choosing and to be available to share my personal minority experiences to others who are willing to hear and listen and just hear what my struggles have been.
Fantastic. You founded a bridge building organization. Would you talk a little bit about how you have participated in bridging the racial and ethnic divide here in the city?
I guess the story I remember the most is we were in Louisville, Kentucky for the All-America City competition in the year 2000. And we had shown a little video. We were one of the 3 nonprofits there showing what's happening in our city. And after the video, they were asking us certain questions and how you deal with the different ethnic groups in your city. And one of our vocational placement counselors, Pei, who was Laotian, put his arm around Eddie, who was Latino, walked up to the microphone and said, "Do you see this man here? If we had met on the streets of Fresno 6 years ago, we would have tried to kill each other. But he's my brother today. I love this man." And they hugged right there. That's where the judges started passing the Kleenex box. So that's the power, I think, what Hope Now the Youth has been doing over the years, is that we break down the divides by revealing our common humanity in Jesus Christ, and we reach out a hand to each other and help each other. I will share a concern I have, all right? And hopefully I don't go too far on this one. At one point we had 2 African-American, 2 black counselors, and they were playing basketball with some of the young men we were trying to reach. And they were calling each other nigga on the court. And so then at another point, I would hear an African-American woman in the market calling her son boy, not using his name, but boy, all right? Angrily. And I thought to myself, you know, I'm an Armenian. If you want to start a fight between two Armenians, you take the term of the oppressor from the Turks and you call each other that name. If you want to disrespect an Armenian, that's what you do. And my concern is that hurt me to hear that. And I told these guys, I don't want to hear it. And they said, oh, well, it ends in AH, it's a sign of affection. I said, well, ER, AH, you know, it's still the oppressor's term you're using for each other. And I said, that doesn't help. That doesn't build respect. And that's what we want to do, build respect among groups. And so that was a concern I had. Gang members, and then of course all the gang members believe the police profiled. One thing we found sort of interesting was that once they began dressing non-gang, they were harassed less, even racially. I mean, you know, they were harassed less. I don't know what the proportion was still between races, but they got less harassment in the same hoods when they stopped dressing like gang members. And the only other experience we have of bridging the racial ethnic divide, in 1993, a 15-year-old blonde boy was abandoned by his family who were opium addicts. And so I said to my staff member, bring him over to our house for a couple of days. That couple of days has turned into 20 years, and Boo is now a full son in our family. And we are waiting for his Filipina fiancé, to get her visa and come to America so that we can fully embrace her.
Thank you. I'm going to take a risk. I'm going to go off script here for a minute, which signals my termination as a future moderator ever again. I'm done. So let me ask this. So what I didn't expect tonight, but what's happening that's striking me, and I thought it would be good here to engage a little bit, because it is so common in our youth culture to use racial pejoratives, to use these words that have in some ways become part of our slang language. But for me, as I hear them, and I've heard them now from you, Reverend Manassian, Ivan, Reverend Sophia, for me, it's very hard for me to hear these words spoken aloud in any context. I struggle with it. I really do. So I'd like to ask this question, and I just want to open it up, and I'm going to let two of you respond, whoever wants to, okay? My question is this: in what ways do you feel like the current use of these derogatory racial slurs in today's youth culture are contributing or not to the problem of racism in our society? Are they playing a role in any way, shape, or form? So I'm going to put that out there. It wasn't on the script. None of you were prepared to speak to it. But I want to ask it, and I'll give space for two of you to make a response. Who would like to respond? Dr. Okuda, Ivan. Okay, let's try that way. And I'll come back to you, Reverend Sophia.
It's a mixed bag. I think people have the right and the privilege to determine how they identify themselves. The Kwanzaa's Kuji Chaluya, self-determination. Again, as someone who was born in the 50s, to hear the N-word cuts to my very core, regardless of the context. But at the same time, I get it, especially when it's between individuals of the same group, right? I get it. I get it that if I am with a bunch of women and we say, hey girls, what's up? But if the former Dr. Welchie would walk in the room and say, hello girls, that's a whole different thing, right? Okay, so among peers, when they use that word among themselves, I get it. And they have a right to do that. It doesn't sit well with me personally, but I would not presume to dictate what they should and shouldn't do. I also get it when there is a relationship that has developed between people of different ethnic groups, an African American and a white male, for example, and they become bros to the point that the white guy can say that to him. And that means something because they can say that without that animosity. At the same time, I'm aware of the power differentials when one person uses that word and another. So again, I say it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag, but I just go back to, I wouldn't presume to dictate how someone else can identify themselves.
Would you speak briefly to it?
Yeah, I think, thank you, Dr. Okuda. I think Dr. Okuda answered most of it. I think another element I just want to bring to it is hip-hop culture, which is more multi-ethnic, more multicultural. And I think in the younger generation, they're redefining some of those terms. I personally don't like it myself, but I see it even among our Latino and even often some of our younger white youth who are authentically urban, who have grown in that environment, and who have the type of, I think, posture and rigor that just kind of breeds or has the smell of the authenticity of their hip-hop relation. So I think I'm aware when I see someone that wants to be urban and they use the term and it totally just sounds, I think you've got to use a level of intuition. You just feel it. You just know that this person is totally trying to fit in and do something that they ain't or they're not, you know. There's my hood coming out of me, right? But yeah, I think we also got to pay attention to this younger generation of hip-hop culture.
It's good. Reverend Sophia, let me ask you this. Would you like to speak to that question, or do you want me to? Because I was going to go to the next question, but I want to give you the choice. Let's speak to that question. Okay, good.
So I'm very aware that I heard this word in the room, and it was intentional. It is not a word that I say very often or that I'm comfortable with, but I think it's important to acknowledge that it's still used in very violent ways and pejorative ways, which is very different than this question against you. And we see this in many types of groups across many lines of difference. The place that really pains me, and I've already spoken to this a little bit, but I want to put the word commodification on it. When people use violent language because it sells things, when we claim other people's cultures and other people's struggle stories, either to appear to fit in, or to be hip, or to make money, it is this re-inscribing of violence on top of violence. And that is what hurts my spirit. I don't want to silence people in their own journeys of reclamation of identity, but selling people's bodies again in the modern era is never okay.
Thank you. Good. There's an interesting dynamic in the room tonight. We are trying to just sort of experience live here sort of the activity of reconciliation and then sort of separation, reconciliation, separation by turning the temperature up and down. And so it's getting cold, it's getting closer together, we turn the heat up and separate, turn it down and close. So it's just part of the experience of the night, all right? Thank you. Pastor Norman, over the course of your ministry, in your engagement with predominantly non-Anglo congregations, as an Anglo pastor who, around issues of justice, have you felt accepted? Have you felt rejected? How have you been received? And again, acknowledging that you haven't been in Fresno for that long. If you would speak to that in Fresno, great. If you want to speak more broadly than that, we would appreciate that as well.
This is a very interesting and difficult question to answer because 35 years of ministry, now my 5th congregation that I'm serving, those have all been predominantly Anglo congregations. But it's interesting, there have been congregations in which the majority of people in that congregation have wished to be more diverse than they are. But the word that keeps coming back is, how do we do that? How do we do that? We reach out, we try, and and make that invitation, but then people come and they don't stay with us. Well, I think looking at that, I think there are some dynamics at play, one of which is, and I raise this as a critique, and this may potentially create a type of dialogue. But I think there is something inherent within the American Protestant Church, which is contextually is grounded in a history of triumphalist dominionism. The whole emergence of the style of American Protestantism that preaches prosperity gospel. That prosperity gospel demands achieving something at somebody else's expense. And for our dominant white congregations to invite people of other significant ethnic differences means we really want you here, but oh, by the way, this is the way we do things. It's very difficult to turn those cultural patterns of worship, of other relationships, as a meaningful experience. One of the avenues that I personally experienced that's giving me some hope is that I happen to serve a congregation that ministers openly to the LGBT community. And I think that our churches do provide a bit of a window, those of our churches who have entered into that. We have some experiences to learn how to relinquish traditional patterns of image and interpretation of scriptures, to broaden the definitions of who we are as individuals. I'm not saying everybody has to agree with what we are doing, but I'm saying I believe that we may have some insight as to how to begin that work and applying it in other directions. Because of that, I made a note to myself here. I had the opportunity to do a same-gendered wedding last year of 2 African-American men. And it was a very informative experience for me doing premarital counseling. As I was anticipating what it was going to be like stepping into an African-American community of some 200 people who were showing up for that wedding. Knowing what I know about the conversations that have taken place in numerous communities. And to my utter amazement, I must say relief and pleasure, my acceptance in that community was just overwhelming. And the experience within that gathered community was everything that I would have experienced in any other wedding that I had done. And that really blew open here in Fresno. This was in Fresno. This really blew open some windows of understanding, perhaps opportunity for me. By and large, I have been, the issues come down to economics when it comes to talking about the great differences, and we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Great, thank you. Panelists, I'm making some midstream adjustments because of time, okay? And so I'm going to try and make sure we get balance in terms of giving the opportunity to respond, but I'm going to make a few sort of adjustments along the way here, okay? Let me say this as a reminder to the audience. We're sort of getting to a point where we would love to receive some questions from you. Again, Andrew and Artie and Bryson and Andy, they have little forms they've passed out. And so if you have a form that you filled out, you have a question that's coming to mind, you can take it to them, or I think if you just sort of raised it up, they'd probably be happy to come get it from you. And then how do we text the questions in, Andrew?
It's on the program.
It's on the program. So look at your program, and there's an option to just text your question in, all right? Okay, so next question. I want to move to this. In between the first conversation about race and this evening, No Name Fellowship, Faith and Community, we sent out a survey via email. Many of you responded. And what we heard from you, which we found interesting and we wanted to pose to the panel, was that some of our constituency really had issue with the definition of racism that we inserted into our email survey, which really spoke to the use or abuse of power. Some people said racism is not about power. Racism is about hatred. And so we thought, wow, that is another perspective that we have not been sort of living with. And so I want to just sort of pose it to the panel here and have you engage it. So again, just to let you off the hook, we're not asking you to give us the definitive answer, but we are asking for your opinion and your perspective. So let's start with Dr. Okuda. Would you share a little bit about how you see the relationship between racism, hatred, and power? What's the relationship?
So I think it's important to go back to the continuum. When we talked about the microaggressions and intentional or unintentional acts all the way to structural racism. If we only look at racism as these horrible acts of hatred, if that's what we see when we see racism, I would venture to say probably no one in this room sees themselves as racist in your action. If that's the only perspective you take on it. And that's real comfortable, right? That's a real comfortable approach. But if you go back to what I was talking about in terms of microaggressions and unintentional acts, but they come from being raised in a racist society. It's really difficult for us when people say, you're racist, because it's so personal, and you know you're a good person. You know you're a nice person. You know you want to treat everyone well. You know that about yourself. But if you negate the reality of the society that you were raised in, then you don't see, did I lock my door right now just because I didn't feel safe or because that person was black? And don't get me wrong, I live in downtown Fresno, and sometimes I forget to lock my car doors, because I try to lock my car doors no matter where I am. But I'm very intentional. If I find myself at a red light and I see, particularly an African-American male, crossing the street, and I realize, oh man, my door's not locked. You know what? I'm not gonna lock it. I don't want him to hear that click. But I ain't stupid. I'm gonna have my hand right there by the lock. Okay? Because it's not because it's black. I used to work in rape prevention and education. So I'm very well aware of safety issues. But I'm gonna be very intentional and not do that to him, right? Because I know when he gets in an elevator, even if he's in a three-piece suit, and there's someone Anglo, particularly a white woman in that elevator, she's going to move her purse to the other side, or clutch it tighter, or maybe walk out of the elevator. So those kinds of acts we have to consider. That's not hatred, but where does it come from? Because if someone that looked different from him in a three-piece suit walked in the elevator, she wouldn't feel the same way. I don't think. We have to look at, why did I think that person I interviewed for the job was not going to have initiative, was not going to have drive, was not going to work hard? Is it because I've been socialized, right, that black people are lazy? I don't even know that that's what I'm operating on. But that comes from racism and being raised in a racist society. When I see a teenage girl that's Anglo with a baby, and maybe I ask her, is that your brother or your sister? But if I see a girl of color, my question is that your baby? Okay, these are real experiences people have every day. So I'm not making this up, okay? I'm not making this up. So I believe that when there are these acts of hatred, the hatred doesn't spur the racism spurs acts of hatred. And so again, you have to look at this continuum. I believe that most people do not intentionally commit acts of racism. I believe most people do not. But I believe they do commit them, okay? And if you don't take that moment to say, why am I making this decision? Why am I acting in this way? Then you will just continue to perpetuate it. Do I have time to say one more thing? Okay. So, example for myself. I was in New York recently. I have a daughter there in New York. You can look at her blog, the Big Girl blog. And she was moving. She was moving from one apartment to another, from Harlem to the East Village. And the movers came in, and they began talking, and I felt this kind of nervousness and an almost fear kind of rise up in me. And I was trying to figure out what is going on. Their accents were Eastern European. And I was trying to figure out, where is that coming from, Francine? And it dawned on me. Movies. How do they portray Russians? How do they portray Eastern Europeans as cruel, ruthless, mobsters? And I'm not used to that language, that sound, that accent. And so this kind of emotion rose up in me. They never knew because I'm a skilled diversity consultant. So we had a great conversation, and they talked about the party they were going to after they finished moving. It was great. But I got to process that and think about other people who, because of their experiences or lack of experiences, or what the media has told them about people who look like me, right? What comes up from them when they see me, right? A big black woman with dreadlocks? What comes up for them? It's real. And am I making sense? Is this tracking for you? Okay. So hatred it's real, but racism, again, I can't say it enough, it's on this continuum. And, and all of us have to look at ourselves personally, accept that we were raised in a racist society, and that influences us. And then begin to make some decisions about, are we going to challenge ourselves in terms of our action?
Thank you.
You said, okay, shut up.
Thank you. Reverend Aston, I want Reverend Aston to speak to this, if you would. Relation between race, power, and hatred.
I believe that racism can include the differences in power, but it doesn't have to necessarily include differences in power. The dictionary definition of racism. 1, a belief or doctrine that inherent differences among the various human races determine cultural or individual achievement, usually involving the idea that one's own race is superior. 2, a policy, system of government, etc., based on such a doctrine. 3, hatred or intolerance of another race or races. Certainly the racial differences incite something negative in the racist. And I purport to say, biblically, that's hatred that's being incited inside that person. My problem, Jesus said, do not think of yourself, or the scriptures say, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment. To me, the inclusion of power in all definitions of racism takes all the angles off the hook. But Jesus said we're all sinners, and we all can hate. He who hates his brother and says he loves God is a liar, the Apostle John wrote. I'll give you one example of what power does to mess things up. Some of you have heard about the knockout game, where people walk up to somebody, just punch them in the face and knock them out. Okay. It seemed to start in New York. It started, it seems, with black gang members or trying to find white people who they thought were Jews and knocking them out. Okay. This happened several times in New York. And then all of a sudden, a white guy knocked out a black man, an older black man. Once that happened, the Justice Department jumped in and called it a hate crime. But after realizing the hypocrisy of what they were doing, they had to retroactively go back and name them all hate crimes. You got it? They were looking for the power difference, all right? When it was racism all along, when it was hatred, a hate crime all along from the beginning. Doesn't matter who's being knocked out. It's all a hate crime. Here's some questions we have to ask ourselves. If an Anglo votes against a black because he's black, that's racism. I think we agree on that. If a Hispanic votes for a Hispanic because she is Hispanic, is that racism? Or is that just redressing the power difference, as someone told me at our last gathering? Jerry Tarkanian's, I'm Armenian, Jerry Tarkanian's drunken basketball teams were destroying motels. While he appeared, on a Coors billboard on Shore Avenue. All right? Got it? I was one of his most vocal critics for that and the fact that his basketball players were not graduating. All right? Terrible graduation rate. I am uncomfortable with championing or denigrating anyone based on a characteristic over which they have no control. I mean, in general. Certainly, power does come into play. In employment, in institutions, housing, and education. But to me, power doesn't always come into play. It's not required to be racist or to hate to have a power difference.
Thank you. There's so much there. We could talk about that for about another 45 minutes or an hour. Here's what I want to do, though. Dr. Okuda mentioned earlier, in terms of where she lives in our city, access. Access to grocery stores, access to drug stores. Pastor Norman spoke to his experience of racism in our city in grocery stores where people were using EBT cards or the CalFresh program, right? In our surveys, again, we heard a lot of feedback about that. There is no issue. Racism is not about race. We don't have a racism problem in our city. We have a class issue in our city. That's some of the feedback we got. So why don't you speak, Ivan, to the relationship between class and race or racism?
I think that's a very complex question because our society is also diverse in their own prejudices. And I mean, a lot of people will probably have some type of issue with people of color or white people. And other people will just have problems with the poor or rich people. So I think it's a very complex question that you're asking, but I think for me, this question is connected to the previous one as well, in that I think it's really, it's an issue of power as well. And I know for me, for example, so just a short story and I'll see how this can fit in, but I wasn't born again, remember? I don't think anybody ever is, right? I grew up hanging out with a lot of guys who were involved in gangs, but I did live in a predominantly poor neighborhood. Now, I just remember one time, like, walking with my friends. I was not a gang member at this time, but I think I used to say with them, like, F the police, they're racist, or this, or that. But then, this was in the late 90s, so at the time, MAGIC, which is the task force that was suppressing the gangs in Fresno at the time, they pulled up, 2 cars pulled up, and then 2 other cars came up as well. And they told us all to come, and some of my friends were like, what? Like, we didn't do anything. Now, half of those guys were gang members, the others weren't, but we were all poor. And I had a bike, and I was also a little bit rebellious. I was just like, why? I didn't do anything. And the officer commanded me again. I said the same thing, and he rushed me. And then 2 other officers went in. My arm was pulled behind my back, and my immediate response was to resist, so I got a few knees in the back. I got some batons to the back. My face even hit the concrete really bad. Then I was held for a couple of hours till it was past curfew. Then I was booked for being out on the streets past curfew. When my mom came to pick me up, she was so angry. She tried to report it at the school. She was trying to find help, but nobody was able to help her. And so I think even though I said F the police, they're all racist, F the system, it's all racist, I think at that point I realized that the type of rhetoric that oftentimes is found among chiefs of police, which is a suppressive, kind of militant type of rhetoric against a particular group, whether it's ethnic or whether it's, or at least in my community, it was an ethnic community, but we were all poor. When you use that kind of language, fighting against this gang, the reality is the people that are a part of that system can't quite distinguish, and a lot of people get hit. So I think when we talk about racism, classism, I feel bad for the officers who are wearing the outfit because they're just following orders. And they're following orders that's coming from a bigger system that has its own prejudices.
Maytag, when we talk about race, talk about racism, you can't talk about that without talking about white privilege, okay? And a lot of people would argue that the way forward as a society, and I hear this a lot, is that we really need to just stop seeing color. Just, you know, I don't need to, I don't even, and here's the expression. I don't see race, I see people. So help me, or help us a little bit tonight with that. Is there any sort of connection between this colorblind ideology and the idea of white privilege? Will you just speak to that how you can?
Yeah, so I would agree that colorblind ideology is connected to white privilege. I also want to say that part of the intent behind colorblindness is about equality, but it doesn't necessarily address inequality. So I'm going to say that again. Part of the intent behind colorblindness is about equality, but it doesn't necessarily address inequality. So let me share a quote that I read a year ago that really sums up the relationship between colorblind ideology and white privilege. It comes from Monica Williams. She published an article in Psychology Today talking about the dynamics between colorblindness and white privilege. And she says, "And in colorblind society, white people who are unlikely to experience disadvantages due to race can effectively ignore racism in American life, justify the current social order, and feel more comfortable with their relatively privileged standing in society. Most minorities, however, who regularly encounter difficulties due to race, experience colorblind ideologies quite differently. Colorblindness creates a society that denies their negative racial experiences, rejects their cultural heritages, and invalidates their unique perspectives. White people can guiltlessly subscribe to colorblindness because they are usually unaware of how race affects people of color in American society as a whole." So based on my experience, I feel like colorblindness is a typical white person's response, typically with good intentions, but I would argue that it's not a healthy position to be, and it's not biblical either. Yeah.
Good, thank you. Pastor Norman, Reverend Sophie, I'll let you two choose. Who else wants to speak to that question?
I would do no better than that.
I really appreciate the definition that you just read, Maytag. I think it's really important. I think there's a longing that is bound up in identity that is behind some of this ideology, where you really want to be in relationship with people. And I think it's very difficult, especially if you understand yourself as someone who is working to reduce personal bias and personal prejudice, to want to get past the importance of difference. And so I think what I would want to emphasize in there, in addition to the power structures, is the erasure of culture that happens. I actually love my ethnic identities. I don't want you to have to ignore them to see me as equal. I want you to love me, including those identities, and sometimes for those identities, and possibly sometimes in spite of them. But really, we need to see each other as whole.
Wonderful. Pastor Norman, since you graciously chose not to respond to that, I'm going to move now to questions and answers from the audience. And so I want to ask this first question of you. The question is this, and understanding these are from you all. This is the first time that any of our panelists have heard any of these questions. So we're going to let them take a deep breath as they hear them, and then they'll respond. Pastor Norman, the question is this, I love it. If we continue learning through a Eurocentric point of view, can we close the gap on racism?
It'll be much more difficult and much slower.
Okay, Good. Anyone else like to speak to that? And let me say thank you, because the quicker we respond, the more questions we can answer, right? So thank you. Good. Would anyone else like to speak to that? Next question. All right. Dr. Okuda, I'm going to come back to you since you're the one that introduced this tonight. Andy, actually introduced this in our first conversation, our first panel as moderator. The question is this: what is the danger, is there any danger, of saying that race is a social construct? And in parentheses it says, particularly for white majority culture to claim this. Does that make sense? Want to read it again?
I think so. I think so. I don't think so, because I think the more each person recognizes their own ethnic identity. So I think there are a lot of us. I did a workshop today, and there's on campus, and there's these things we do called up down. We call different groups, and this one guy never stood, right? And so I was like, so what's your ethnic identity? And he's like, you know, white, right? Whereas everyone else had stood for French, German, Russian, African of descent, Asian. And so I began to kind of dig a little bit, and he was able to pull out Irish and English and French. And the more Anglos and folks of European descent begin to identify their own ethnic culture, actually the more helpful that piece is right then. So, yeah, I think getting away from this thing of race is actually helpful. And looking more at ethnic identity, then people don't realize there's us and them. There's us and them. We all have an ethnic culture. Sometimes we have to just dig a little harder to find out what specifically it is.
Thank you. Good. Would anyone else like to speak to that other than Dr. Booth? Anyone else want to respond? Okay. Next question. Ivan, let me ask you this. How do you begin, here's the question, how do you begin to see genuinely someone of another culture? And it goes on, it says, how do you pull back the invisible veil, quote from W.B. Du Bois, right, that separates us from one another? How do you begin to see someone genuinely of another culture?
I think number one, intentionality. Intentionality is very important, because if you're not intentional, you're just not going to be able to see what's behind that veil. And I think another number two, I would say, relationship building, which entails listening to their story. Like, what is their story, and hear their story. Like, what actually, what does it contain? And then three, I think also, like, being honest. So I would just say those three. I mean, honest and like listening, but also giving feedback. I think the hardest thing for me has been when I share my story with someone and they just nod, or they just disagree. I think I want to have some interactive feedback. I want someone to be authentic and honest, but I think it's those three things.
That's great, thank you. Reverend Aston, would you be willing to elaborate maybe on some of those thoughts?
My wife and I teach marriage mentoring courses, and we basically say to couples, don't expect your spouse to be a mind reader. I would say the same thing is true many times in racial relationships. You know, maybe we're afraid to open up. I can understand some of the fear, but hey, if I'm sitting in front of you and I've offered you a meal, and you know, I want to hear your story, don't play games with me. I want to hear your story. I'm asking questions to hear your story. Tell me your story. The whole thing of working with gang members was to build trust, where they'd be willing to tell us their real story. It was always exciting to hear their real stories. And it was affirming for them to have someone listen to their real story. So again, let's not make each other, let's not force each other to be mind readers. All right? Let's try to be open with each other.
Good, thank you. Reverend Sophia, here's a question I'd like to ask.
Bill.
Oh, yes, please, yeah.
Real quick.
That's correct.
Also be willing to take risks and make mistakes. And also, on the other end, be willing to allow folks to take risks and make mistakes.
That's good. Thank you for that. Reverend Sophia, question's been asked here, I'd like to ask you. And the reason I'm asking you is because my understanding, we've just had a chance to get to know each other a little bit, is that you had some experience, and I believe even so now, serving in predominantly Anglo congregations. Is that true? Okay. So here's the question. I hope you can help us with this. How can members of predominantly Anglo churches begin to address issues of racism and white privilege in their congregations without being dismissed or rejected? Would you be willing to speak to that? And I think, Pastor Norman, I'd love to hear you follow up.
I come to this question not only I'm working with a fantastic congregation right now that is predominantly white. Our denomination is predominantly white. But I served for 4 years as a director for racial and ethnic concerns for the Unitarian Universalist Church nationally. And the biggest piece of advice I give people over and over again is to actually do your own work. And I don't mean that to be as weird as it sounds, but to actually start within the community. So I think there are two places. One is to do the own internal work to figure out why is it that you're undertaking this effort? Who are you as a community? Because I think that whenever we engage in any kind of bridge building work, that place of fear of dismissal, fear of not being respected, comes about going in with preconceived intentions about how you will be received. And that may be hard to hear, I want to say it again, is to not go in with preconceived expectations of how you will be received. There are things that help with that, though. Getting out of your comfort zone. I encourage congregations to do more than open the doors wide and invite people to come to you. That is hospitality. Hospitality matters. But you know, if there's a cultural film festival in your community, show up. Go to the places of the communities with whom you're trying to build relationships. It is a lot to ask of people to always come and educate you. That is actually one of the things that feeds into power differences. That needs to happen also, making space, expecting different types of people to actually be present in your community and to think about what their needs might be. But we learn best when we are actually in one another's spaces, when we make the effort. If you are known to show up, people will respond to you differently. One last thing is that I like to challenge communities to ask other groups what they know about their organization. So I would go to Pastor Norman and say, what does your church tell you about the Unitarian Universalist Church of Fresno? That will give me really important information before we're trying to do any kind of relationship.
Thank you. Pastor Norman.
Yeah, I would echo much of what you have shared. Just in our personal experience, one of the things we've attempted to do at First Congregational here has been to develop relationships and going out into parts of the community in wider Fresno that we typically are found at. We received an invitation to partake in a recognition this last summer of those who have died as a result of gun violence. There were several of us from our congregation who stood out in public with the folks at St. Therese and other places to give public witness and testimony to them. A year ago, Booker, Lewis, and I collaborated, and we brought our congregations together during Holy Week for one observance at our church, and then we had, I think we had close to 40 of our people who ventured over to share the West Fresno clergy in every Friday services. Those were simply worship venues. We've had some conversation with some other congregations on the west side of where we might be entering into a program of helping them reconstruct a facility where they are moving into, and they don't have the resources that maybe we might be able to share. So I think your point about moving into other communities rather than inviting people in to educate us at our place is a really important part of that. This is done in a variety of ways. Fresno has one of the most, Fresno Clovis has one of the most meaningful crop walks in the country. Now, this is unfortunately is not a broadly diverse opportunity in the community to give witness to the question of hunger, but it becomes a new opportunity for all of us to literally take to the streets in a very visible, non-violent way to say, hunger matters, responding to hunger matters. And so I think that there are innumerable opportunities. I will also say that I've been very impressed by my having exposed myself to the work of Millennium Fellowship as one who comes out of the progressive Christian community, to gain great appreciation for a lot of the entrepreneurial, evangelical outreach that is happening in communities that we typically don't interrelate with. And I think there's an enormous exchange of information that comes when we gather in those kinds of settings together. So that's the pitch for Millennium Fellowship and Faith and Unity.
Thank you. Thank you, Pastor. We are preparing now, just a moment, not quite yet, but just a moment to turn to the audience, because we are all here, panelists, audience alike, because we want to go deeper in this conversation concerning race in this city. And the reality is that my hope is that we're all here because we recognize that if we cannot figure out how we can move beyond and move more deeply into relationship with one another across racial and ethnic boundaries, we cannot figure that out, it will forever plague our city. And we will blame all kinds of other things for why our city is struggling over here or is failing over there, but many of us will know that part of that reason is because of the racism that continues to exist and to drive some of the narrative resources of our city in ways that are unjust and inequitable. So we want to tonight, in just a moment, turn to one another, and we're going to begin to share a little bit of our stories, because tonight is about the interpersonal relationship. Tonight is about hearing each other's stories, sharing stories. Before we do that, though, and turn to the audience, I want to give the panelists just sort of a final 30 seconds to share a final thought. Here we are. We need to press forward. The conversations are good, but they are hardly the end. So what would you say to us? Just anything that maybe you felt like you haven't shared that you need to share tonight within the last 30 seconds here. I want to give each of you a little bit of time. Reverend Massey, you're pointing. I want to know what you're pointing at. You want to start down there? Okay, Dr. Okuda. Okay. Would you be prepared to share?
First, I want to just thank you all for being here. Sometimes it's hard to listen and hear, and then I just want to encourage you. I love what Maytag said about intentionality and relationship. And it's scary sometimes to cross those bridges and say to someone, can we go to lunch? Can we go to coffee? Can I process this with you? I did something that seemed to rub somebody wrong. Can you help me with it? Maybe it was a cultural thing. I go back to what I said earlier. Take those risks. Know you're going to make mistakes. You're going to make mistakes. Try again. Try again.
There's two things. I think the first and most important is theologically, you need to look at what God has to say about this, because it's one thing to be passionate about it but not be biblically sound. And so I think if you have the two, it can be super dynamic, but if you only have one or the other, I think it can be detrimental to the people that you come in contact with. So with that, read what God has to say about being racially reconciled. Not racially reconciled, but what God has to say about reconciliation. I think too oftentimes we narrow reconciliation and we say, what about race? Like, what do we do about that? And I think reconciliation needs to encompass geographically. When you look at Fresno, we're pretty divided on Shaw, right? Denominationally, we're pretty segregated as well when you think about the different churches and the different denominations. And so look at the bigger picture of reconciliation in general and see what God stirs in your heart about that. And the second thing is, know that when you ask someone to share their minority experience, it's risky. It was very risky for me to be up here this evening, to be this vulnerable with each and every one of you guys, not knowing where the heck you stand on your personal journey. And so yeah, know that it's risky and know that sometimes when we share with you, I'm gonna disagree with what Ivan said earlier. I actually don't want you to give me any feedback. Sometimes when I share, I just want you to listen. And if it's a moment for you to lament with me. And if it's a painful moment, just let it be painful. If it's an awkward moment, let it be awkward. And if it's a funny moment, laugh, you know? But if you're awkward, then it's gonna make the whole situation awkward. So theologically, look at what God has to say about reconciliation. Know that it's risky, but also know that for me, if you come and ask me to share my stories with you, I don't want you to respond back. Unless if I ask you, hey, can you help me understand and translate all of this?
Thank you. Pastor Bowman, 30 seconds.
I'll do this in 30 seconds. This was actually going to be my answer to an earlier question on color blindness. I'll close with this. I was going to be uncomfortable in saying that I want to be colorblind, or desire to be colorblind. I want to see the diversity, to claim it as real, to cherish it for all it says and challenges me to do, to continue to strive to understand, to learn the language of the oppressed, to discover what I must give up or give away in order for all of us to realize a more equitable democracy and to live a faith in which I believe God is still speaking to us, saying, do justice, love mercy, walk humbly in God's name with all God's creatures.
In our tradition, we are in a place of covenant around not only affirming but also promoting the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which is really a high standard. And what I want to close with is just this reality that that work requires of us not only to look for the good, to assume that there is good in the person in front of us, but also to be in relationship with them in a way that promotes that good. That can be complicated theologically. So the other thing I want to say is just a reminder that the person telling their story is the only person that has authority over that story. And it's a very important thing in terms of agency. We talk about rehumanizing people, honoring their humanity. If someone is risking their story with you, even if you have all kinds of analyses, all kinds of personal experiences, no one has lived that story but that person.
That's great. Thank you.
I just have two things. One, if your theology or your faith is not driving you to love your oppressor or your enemy, whether the enemy or oppressor is white, black, Asian, whatever color, if your theology is not driving you to love that person, I think that theology must be questioned. And two, I really believe that the problem of racism, yeah, it's among human beings, and I think it's two-way. I don't think it's just one way. Believe me, I'm married cross-ethnically, and I've had to wrestle with my own hatreds against my wife, who is white. So I know very well that racism is two-way. But I'm not too worried about human beings, because when Jesus mentions his own name, every knee bows. But what I am worried about is the system, because it's the same system that crucified our Lord. And I think it's that system that needs to be challenged.
When I left the pastorate of Pilgrim Armenian Congregational Church to spend the rest of my working years south of Shaw, there are a number of people who thought I was crazy. But that's been a measuring point for me. As you're in touch with God this evening and you're a follower of Jesus, he's going to be talking to some of you tonight, maybe a lot of you, and putting an idea in your head for reconciliation. Here's one of the measurements I use for ideas that God puts in my head. Is it crazy enough to be from God? Good question to ask. Is it crazy enough to be from God? If it is, it probably is from God.
Thank you, Max. Can you all give this panel a round of applause? We are so grateful for you all risking so much tonight, sharing so openly, and being vulnerable. This, as we acknowledge, is just the fact that this conversation is happening very often, is a hard conversation to have. And you all have generously agreed to sit here before us all and to be transparent and share your true thoughts and feelings and perspectives, knowing that there are people in the audience who disagree with what you're saying. And they have no chance to respond, and you can't respond to them, but the dialogue's already here. But thank you, because that's no small commitment by you. We are going to step down for just a little bit, give these panelists a break. They have committed to stay after tonight, and so I definitely encourage you to further a conversation with them tonight, or maybe better yet, another day. But they'll be here to dialogue with after the event. What we want to do now is turn our attention to one another. Tonight, again, is about interpersonal relationships and the interpersonal nature of race and racism. So what we want to do is, as we introduced ourselves this evening, we modeled sort of what we're going to ask you to do now. And that is to share a little bit of your story. So I think there's a slide. There it is. Okay. So the first question says, what is your cultural autobiography? How have cultural identifiers shaped who you are? Number 2, to what degree, if any, do you see interpersonal racism as a problem here in Fresno? And number 3, what roles, if any, do individual believers play in alleviating this racism? Here's what we're going to do. We're going to need someone in your group to provide some leadership, all right, and kind of walk you through these questions. The goal, as Bryson led off this evening, is to listen. To listen. We're not looking for common thinking here tonight. We're asking you to listen to one another, acknowledging that there may be some thoughts and opinions and experience that you haven't had or you might disagree with. That's okay to disagree, but listen. Be open. Be open to the fact that what that person in your group is sharing may actually be right and you could actually be wrong. So listen. Be open. Open your heart tonight. We're going to have you break up into groups. It would be preferable, but we're limited on time. It would be preferable if you were not in groups that were all the same ethnic or of the same ethnic group. All right, that's sort of counterproductive to what we're wanting to achieve tonight. So if you could quickly find groups of 4 or 5 and kind of make them as diverse ethnically as possible, that would be best. So we're going to do that now. All right. So why don't we try and get into groups of 4 or 5.